Hi and welcome to Alexander Technique London. My name's Adrian and today we're going to discuss true primary movements as it relates to breath and the Alexander Technique. Now, usually I try to keep these videos very practical and this one will be as well, but there's going to be a little bit of a history lesson up front as well, so bear with me until I get to the practical part. So, true primary movements. It's not a phrase you'll hear much within the Alexander Technique, and if you've had some lessons and you've done some reading, you may not have come across it. Even if you're a fellow teacher, you may be thinking, what's Adrian talking about? I've never heard of it. And fair enough, because it wasn't something Alexander wrote a lot about. But he did mention it and seemed to kind of brush it under the carpet later. And I kind of wish he hadn't, so I'm kind of mentioning this because I'd like to personally bring it back. I really like the phrase, true primary movement. What could be more primary than your movement through breathing? I mean, if you're not moving there, you're in trouble. So yeah, our breath is a primary movement. And what did he mean by true primary movement? Well, let me just jump back a bit and let you know how I first heard about this. It was actually in a blog by my colleague Harvard Hegdal about 3 years ago, and he did some research and he did a blog on this and on this phrase. You have to remember that Alexander, well, you have to remember, I'm going to tell you if you weren't already aware, that Alexander was kind of known as the breathing man in his early stages of the evolution of his technique. And interestingly, for much longer than I realized, I assumed it was a moniker that he had kind of ditched by the time he moved from Australia to London in about 1904, 1905. But I've seen evidence that he was still calling his work, what does he call it? Something like the re-education of the respiratory system, even as late as 1915. So the evolution was ongoing. It wasn't quite the Alexander Technique as we think of it now, maybe, with a much stronger emphasis on the head-neck relationship we tend to have now. Now, I think it's a shame he dropped the phrase, personally, and I would like to bring it back, so this is me doing that. Why did he drop it is an interesting question. I think in part is because I think he realized any effort to get people to breathe correctly and talk about it too much tended to create more interference. To be honest, that happens with primary control as well, the head-neck relationship. You get people trying to do it, like, I've got my head forward and up, that classic Alexander phrase, head forward and up, and people try to do it, and you can see it's now an interference. And I think he realized, there were issues around that as well in the end, but with breathing, I think it bothered him even more. He just wanted this natural thing to happen, so didn't want to highlight it too much in the way he talked about it. After a while, because he certainly was, very strong on breathing in the early days. So, what did he mean by true primary movement? Well, it was the movement of the torso and the movement of the rib cage in the thoracic area, thoracic relating to the spine, because that's where the rib cage articulates with the spine. Now, there's an interesting observation to be made about that, and there's one that, as far as I'm aware, Alexander didn't write about. He may be aware of it, but he didn't write about it. And I actually double-checked with Harvard about this a couple of days ago, sort of preparing for this video, and he was unaware of any writing about this as well, having researched it more. So what happens is that because the rib cage and the diaphragm articulate with the spine, that with the movement of breathing, the spine itself moves as well. And I find that very interesting for several reasons. So for starters, if your spine's moving through breath, you can forget about the idea of having good posture because you're always moving. You're always moving. Even in your sleep, you are moving. Your spine is moving. So what you don't want to do is have a correct posture, because you're bound to relate that to some sort of fixed position. And if you have a fixed position and your spine can't move naturally with breath, you can't breathe fully and your breathing will become shallower. Also highlights just how dynamic the whole system is, because we're upright, obviously, we're bipeds, and we've got ankles, knees, hips, all the vertebrae of the spine, this heavy head on top. We're really wobbly already. And then we create an extra wobble along the spine as we breathe. So you can just, like I say, get rid of the idea of a correct posture and start thinking more of dynamic poise and dynamic support from the ground up underneath. So the other reason I find it interesting and a useful observation point is that all we can really do in the Alexander technique, and what Alexander actually said quite explicitly, was the only thing we can know is when we're wrong. So what we're really trying to find out is if we're ever interfering. So we need to know what we're observing to know whether we're observing the interference or not. Now, the most obvious interference, the one we talk about a lot in the Alexander technique, is the head-neck relationship and the startle reflex. And that's a really, really good place to start. But there are other ways, some more useful than others. You could notice your fists are clenching and go, oh, just relax them. There's obviously an interference, you're over-tensing. That may not affect your over-coordination in the same way that your head-neck relationship does, but it's an observation that you're unduly tensing. But this true primary movement's a nice one as well. So you can find out that basically through observation whether you're interfering with your breath. It also answers another really important question I get asked a lot, which is, how do I sit on a sofa, or how do I sit and recline on my, my work chair at my computer? And the question therefore becomes not about positions, but about movement. So even when reclining, you're in movement. Even when you're asleep, you're in movement. But the semi-recline of, just leaning back against, I don't have a chair back on this, I'm on the piano still, so I don't want to fall backwards, but if I just mimic it, if I lean back, and this could either be on an office chair with support, or it could be on your sofa while you watch TV, instead of concerning yourself about the position, if you can observe true primary movement through the length of your spine, you can make an observation of whether that's being interfered with or not. So if you're reclining nicely by hinging from the hip joints and keeping the contact with your sit bones, and you're nicely supported by whatever's supporting you, your spine will still move. And you can make an observation about that, go, if that movement's there, I'm probably fine. If I'm free to move, no problem. It's when we do things like we tend to tuck the pelvis under and kind of fall on, sit on our tailbone and tend to fold, sort of a bit off camera, but fold there. And we kind of slouch like that. Now my back can't move, my spine can't move, it's in this collapsed way. Yeah, and I don't like doing that for too long, it feels horrible, to be honest. I hate mimicking these poor posture things. But if I can feel that movement's free, if I have freedom, there's not a problem. Now, how do you make this observation? Because it is actually quite subtle. So I have a video on sort of some breathing exercises or procedures. We don't like the word exercise so much in the Alexander technique because it sounds like you do something to get it right. And as you know, we're not interested in you doing things correctly, but freely. But I have another video on this. So I'm going to somewhat skim over this and then link to the video. I'll probably put it in the description and maybe a card on screen, on the end screen. But by doing long out breaths, and that causes the ribcage to pull in and your diaphragm to fully release. What you're effectively doing by doing long out breaths is exaggerating the amount of movement in breathing. And because you're exaggerating the movement, you've got a better chance of sensing it. Now, the other thing you can do to increase your chance of sensing it is to get some good tactile feedback in your back and your spine by doing it while you're lying down. So I recommend it doing in the classic constructive rest or semi-supine. And again, I'm not going to cover that right now. I shall put another link for that as well. But give or take, you lie on your back, book under your head, your knees raised up, feet flat on the table. But if you do the long out breaths while lying down like that, it gives you a better feedback because you can feel the contact of your spine against the floor. And that will give you a sense of the movement. Now, it is quite subtle and it's very different from one person to another. So I'm not going to tell you, you should feel this or you should feel that. You'll feel what you feel. In certain cases, and I've come across this, a number of times, and I've had, people with me in person, so I can double check it tactilely myself with my own hands. Some people have a very natural sort of flat lower back. I don't have much of a lordosis, as it's called. And if that's the case, you might find that part of your back doesn't move as much, or even at all, or if it does, so small that it seems imperceptible to you. So I've had my hands under someone's lower back and gone, yeah, that's not moving much. No wonder you're struggling to feel it. But there will still be movement elsewhere, so you find movement wherever you find it. On the whole, if your lower back is moving enough for you to sense it, you'll notice at the end of your out breath that the lower back is closer to the table, so the arch flattens out. And then as the breath comes back in, it arches back up again. And then at the top of your breath, with a lung full, you'll feel your upper back push into the table more. So there's a little wave that goes along the length. Now, there's another thing you can do to exaggerate it further still. So if you're struggling to feel that movement, or you want to just enjoy the freedom of the movement, because this is something I encourage people to do, to really enjoy the freedom of that movement. And I'll go off piste again a bit, because another thought's come to mind. Another reason why I like it is if you have back pain or back problems, you're probably trying to protect it by stiffening. And that stiffening then becomes an issue in its own right and causes, that rigidity causes extra issues. So if you're lying down, hopefully feeling pretty safe, actually, you're lying down, you can afford, hopefully, to really release and allow the movement to happen. So you do a nice long out breath, breathe out as far as you can, and then let go. You don't actively breathe in, you just release and let air come back in. And as that happens, you will be moved. And you can really let go into enjoying being moved. Enjoy the movement of the spine, as well as obviously the rib cage. And that hopefully can teach you to stop trying to overprotect your back all the time, your spine all the time. And let it be more fluid, because that's what it needs to be. It doesn't need to be rigid and held and protected. It needs to be dynamic and fluid. That's what a healthy spine is. Anyway, back to the point I was going to make. To exaggerate the movement either further, what you can do is when you've breathed out all the air you can, hold it out for an indefinite period of time first. What will happen, and don't panic about thinking, I'm holding my air out, there's no air in there. There's plenty. When you blow out all the air you can, there's still slightly more than 50% of your full lung capacity in there, because the lungs don't collapse. It's not like a balloon. It's still open. There's still space in there. And that space has still got oxygen in it, and it's slowly but surely, it's going to be dissolved into the bloodstream through the lungs. And that takes time. And you're only lying down doing this, so, you don't need a huge amount of oxygen. So this takes as long as it takes. It may take 5 seconds, it may take 10 seconds or 15. It doesn't actually matter. Because what's going to happen as you hold your breath out is the oxygen levels are obviously going to start to go down a bit in your blood. So your blood oxygen levels will start to decrease. And at a certain point, the part of your brain that measures that will go, getting a bit low. I think I'd like to let some air come back in now. You'll kind of get a little tap on the shoulder, go, that's enough. Instinctively, you'll know. And what you'll do is you'll just stop holding and let air come back in. The ribcage will want to ping back out into expansion. But because the blood oxygen level is a bit lower, the whole mechanism, the whole organism, including your nervous system and everything, will instinctively generate a bigger in-breath, which of course is generating more movement. And because it's exaggerating the movement more, you've got a better chance of observing it. Now, it's sometimes worthwhile just spending a few minutes with this, because if you're not used to observing this, it can seem quite subtle. And if your nervous system, if you're a bit heightened, and a bit noisy inside, it's maybe harder to make these observations as well. The analogy I like to give is if you've got a pond with choppy waters and you throw a pebble in, you can't see where it landed. But if the water's really nice and smooth and you chuck a pebble in, you get these lovely concentric circles and these rings. And you can say, oh, it landed there. So by spending some time doing some long out breaths first, we calm down the nervous system, we calm the waters. And therefore, it's therefore easier to make observations. And just to recap, the purpose of the long out breaths is also, as we do them, it down-regulates the nervous system. It's just a physiological response. So it's a great thing to do anyway, to practice long out breaths, particularly as you first start your constructive rest, because it scratches the itch of thinking you need to be doing something. And in doing so, you're actually kicking in the parasympathetic nervous system, your vegetative resting state. And as you quieten down, therefore, that makes observation easier. So, yeah, you will observe what you observe. It's not for me to tell you. It will be different for everyone. But in time, you'll get to know your own movements, and you can really enjoy being moved. So long out breath, let go and let yourself be moved. In fact, you can wait until the in-breath turns itself around into an out-breath and wait until, say, you're halfway out before you even physically join in intentionally to blow the rest out. Well, like I said, there's more details on that breathing exercise in the video I'll link to. In time, you'll tune into it and you'll get better at observing it because it is subtle. So I can sense it just sitting here. Now, I wouldn't if I hadn't brought that to mind. I don't go around being aware of it. That would just be silly. I don't have that sort of bandwidth of my brain just being aware of everything all the time. I'm sure everyone does. Anyone does. But if I choose to, I can sense it. So I can sense it as I'm even talking. Talking's an out breath. And I can feel my lower back kind of straighten out a bit. Then when air comes back in, I can feel it, the breath, as the breath comes back up, I get a little more of a curve in my lower back, and my upper back then starts to push backwards a bit. Like I say, it's subtle, but I am aware of it as movement, which means in sitting, if you want to sit freely, if you've seen my videos before where I've mentioned it, I call sitting standing on your bottom. It's the same thing for the torso. And the one thing we struggle with that is because we no longer have our legs in the equation, we're more stable, which kind of encourages a little bit of fixing a bit. So we still want to remind ourselves we're nice and free, mobile and wobbly. By being able to tune into that movement, it reminds you just how wobbly you are, that you are in fact not just still. And so you can find some freedom in the spine through the breath. So I think that covers everything I wanted to say about that. If you happen to be interested in online lessons, I am available for online lessons, and I have a 6-week introductory course. And until the next time, take care. All right, bye.